Good afternoon and welcome to our fall WOP seminar series. WOP equips leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equality. I'm Michela Carlana, an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before we start, we wanted to offer a virtual land acknowledgement to honor local indigenous communities on the land where Harvard University sits, which is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unleased homeland of the Massachusetts people. The surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and the Nippon Set band of the Massachusetts. The WOP team have posted the link to our land acknowledgement in the chat and encourage you to all explore the resources in addition to the readings, the statement. Our seminar this fall will explore how gender researchers, policymakers, and practitioners can commit to strengthening the focus of intersectional research. We will explore how gender intersects with other social identities, such as race, class, national origin, disability, parental status, and sexual orientation. Our intersectional focus will not only address the unique experience of people with intersecting identities, but to also engage with the systematic bias and oppression which characterize these experiences. Many of the researchers we are featuring in our seminar series are also featuring the Gender Action Portal, and I encourage you all to explore the Gender Action Portal's intersectional work at gap.hks.harvard.edu. In the US, October is recognized as the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And today we are actually thrilled to host Professor Katie Wang presenting interpersonal consequences of ableism, what happens when people with disabilities confront patronizing help. Dr. Katie Wang is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Yale School of Public Health. As a social psychologist by training, Dr. Wang's research focuses on the role of stigma as a social determinant of mental and behavioral health disparities, with a specific emphasis on people with physical disabilities and psychiatric conditions. She's a member of the Committee on Disability Issues in the Psychology within the American Psychological Association, and has presented research on the antecedents and consequences of ableism to a wide range of audience, including at a public workshop hosted by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She was recently recognized as a rising star by the Association of Psychological Science for her outstanding accomplishment as an early career academic. The goal of her research agenda is to identify more effective policies and programs to positively impact health and education outcomes globally. Our speaker will present for 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions from our virtual audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. Those who have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted to ask your questions out loud. We do ask that any audience questions be very brief, beyond the topic, be posted in the form of a question and related to our presenters' research. My colleague Katie will be managing the question and answer portion of the seminar. So thank you so much, Katie, for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Michaela, for the introduction. Please allow me a moment while I start my screen share. All right, can someone give me a verbal confirmation? Let me know if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can see your slides, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. So it's a real honor for me to be here today. I am a stigma researcher, as Michaela mentioned, and I am also an Asian American woman with a disability. So ableism and intersectionality is something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about, both on a professional and personal level. So I am very excited to have this opportunity to share some of my research with you on the interpersonal consequences of ableism and how these consequences might be shaped by the intersection between disability and gender. So to give you an overview of my talk today, I am going to start by providing a little background information about the definition and scope of ableism. So by ableism, I am referring to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination directed towards people with disabilities. I will then highlight patronizing help as a subtle but insidious form of ableism. And to do this, I will present a series of 4 studies I have conducted, which looked at how patronizing help is perceived and what happens when people with disabilities confront patronizing help. I will end this presentation by highlighting a few directions in which I would like to take my program of research in the area of disability and intersectionality. So to begin with some basic definitions, disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities. While many of us might be under the impression that people with disabilities only represent a small minority of the general population, this is actually not the case. According to recent data from CDC, disability affects 1 in 4 adults in the United States, so that's 25% of the US population. And even those who are not disabled at present might acquire disability anytime through a number of circumstances, such as illness, injury, or just the reality of aging. An important barrier that people with disabilities face in both higher education and professional settings is the experience of ableism. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that our society has become significantly more accessible to people with disabilities since the passage of the Americans with Disability Act in 1990, also known as the ADA. But the reality is that ableism still remains extremely pervasive in a lot of different contexts. So, for example, people with disabilities routinely face employment discrimination when they are trying to find or keep a job. And accessibility issues, such as lack of ramps or elevators for wheelchair users, or websites that are not compatible with screen reading software for people who are blind, are unfortunately still a common occurrence. So for my talk today, I am going to focus on how ableism manifests itself on the interpersonal level by coloring the interactions between people with and without disabilities. A key factor that drives ableism in the interpersonal context is the ambivalent stereotype of people with disabilities as warm but incompetent. One consequence of these stereotypes is that people with disabilities are often treated like children. So as an example, when college students gave directions to an adult using a wheelchair, they tend to use vocabulary and a tone of voice that they would normally use with a 12-year-old child. And this happened even when the disabled adult was clearly identified as a working professional. Another consequence of these ambivalent stereotypes is that people with disabilities often receive unsolicited help that they don't really want or need. Although it is generally well-intentioned, unsolicited help can come across as extremely patronizing because it is based on this assumption that its recipients are not capable of handling their own affairs. People who receive unsolicited help tend to experience more negative emotions and lower self-esteem. And accepting unsolicited help can also reinforce the stereotype that people with disabilities are incompetent. These negative consequences present a dilemma for people with disabilities. On the one hand, individuals might wish to assert their independence by declining any unnecessary help, but on the other hand, declining such assistance can result in significant interpersonal backlash, where members of the public come to see people with disabilities as ungrateful and rude. So to better understand this dilemma, I conducted 2 sets of studies where I investigated the issue of patronizing help for people with disabilities. The first set of studies, which I labeled as studies 1 and 2 in this presentation, were actually conducted as part of my dissertation, and they provided an initial investigation of how patronizing help is perceived by blind versus sighted people, and how blind people are perceived by sighted participants when they confront patronizing help. The second set of studies, which I refer to as studies 3 and 4 in today's presentation, were conducted more recently as a replication and extension of the first 2 studies. Specifically, in these 2 studies, I look at some intersectionality considerations in terms of how disability and gender might come together to shape the perceptions of patronizing help. And we also looked at whether the results we found with blind people would potentially generalize to people with other physical disabilities. So in the first study, I began by examining whether people with and without disabilities might have different views on patronizing help. Specifically, I tried to address the question of whether blind people will perceive patronizing help as less appropriate compared to sighted people. So we know from previous research that majority and minority group members often view positive stereotypes differently. For example, in one experiment, whereas white participants tend to find stereotypes such as Blacks are good athletes to be complimentary, most Black participants in this study find these stereotypes to be prejudiced and restrictive. So based on these results, I hypothesized that where sighted people will find patronizing treatment to be more appropriate than hostile treatment, blind people will find both types of treatment to be highly inappropriate.
My child on this horse.
So we had a total of 268 participants. This included 166 sighted participants that were recruited from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, also known as MTurk. And we had 106 blind participants who were recruited through email listservs that are affiliated with national blindness organizations. So for those of you who might not be familiar with MTurk, it is an online platform that allows individuals to complete surveys in exchange for small payments. In the past few years, MTurk has become a popular data collection tool for social psychologists, and evidence suggests that the quality of MTurk data is comparable to the quality of survey data collected using more traditional recruitment methods. Participants for this study were randomly assigned to read one of 2 possible scenarios. In both experimental conditions, participants were told that Mary, who is a blind working adult, was walking by herself using a white can, and she stopped at a street corner to ask a pedestrian for directions to the nearest bus stop because her regular route to work was blocked by construction. In one version of the scenario, the pedestrian responded to Mary in a patronizing way. So instead of answering her question, the pedestrian grabbed Mary's arm without her permission, and they said, "Oh, it's too dangerous for you to be walking around by yourself. Let me take you to the bus stop." In another version of the scenario, the pedestrian responded to Mary in a hostile way. So they said, "Oh, it's too dangerous for you to be walking around by yourself. You should turn around and go home." We then asked participants to rate the extent to which they perceive the pedestrian's behavior as appropriate using these 4 items. These include appropriate, helpful, condescending, and overbearing. So as you can see from the graph here, there was a significant interaction between treatment type and participant disability status. So for sighted participants, patronizing treatment was perceived as more appropriate than hostile treatment. However, if you look at the bars for blind participants, you will see that there was no significant difference in the perceptions of patronizing versus hostile treatment. As a matter of fact, given the perceived appropriateness was rated on a 7-point scale, you will see that blind participants perceived both types of treatment to be highly inappropriate. So what these results are telling us is that there is a significant divergence in perspectives between how blind and sighted people perceive patronizing help. And this discrepancy might have important downstream consequences when it comes to how blind people are perceived by the sighted public. So in study 2, I examined some of these consequences by looking at how the blind target is perceived by sighted participants when she confronts patronizing versus hostile treatment. Specifically, I hypothesized that the blind target who confronts the sighted pedestrian will be perceived as less warm than her non-confronting counterpart, especially when the pedestrian behaves in a patronizing rather than blatantly hostile manner. I also expected that this interaction will be mediated by the perceived appropriateness of the pedestrian's behavior. In other words, I hypothesized that participants will penalize the target more for confronting patronizing treatment because they feel that the target is just overreacting to what should have actually been considered as appropriate or helpful behavior in the first place. So we had 249 MTARG participants for this study. All of the participants self-identified as sighted. As in study 1, we manipulated the pedestrian's behavior to indicate either patronizing or blatantly hostile treatment. In addition, we also manipulated the blind target's response to indicate either confrontation or non-confrontation. So we have the same scenario from study 1. Again, Mary, who is a blind working adult, was walking by herself, and she stopped to ask the pedestrian for directions to the nearest bus stop. After describing the pedestrian's behavior as either patronizing or hostile, as we did before, we also described the blind target's response. So in the confrontation condition, Mary responded by saying, "I can handle myself just fine and was only trying to get some simple directions." Whereas in the non-confrontation condition, she said nothing and either just accepted assistance being offered, which was in the patronizing condition, or in the hostile condition, Mary just walked away. After reading the scenario, participants first indicated their perceptions of the pedestrian's behavior using the same items from study 1. They also provided ratings on their perceptions of how warm and likable Mary is as a person. So as you can see from the graph here, Mary was perceived as significantly less warm when she confronted the pedestrian. And this penalty was especially pronounced when Mary confronted patronizing rather than hostile treatment. I also conducted a mediation analysis with only those participants in the confrontation conditions. And I found the perceived appropriateness of the pedestrian's behavior significantly mediated the effect of treatment type on target perceptions. In other words, participants penalized Mary more for confronting in a patronizing condition because they believe that the pedestrian's actions were more appropriate in that case than in the hostile condition. So taken together, these two studies illustrate that people with and without disabilities tend to view patronizing treatment very differently. And this discrepancy in perceptions can lead to a significant backlash against people with disabilities who refuse such assistance by engaging in direct confrontation. You may have noticed, however, that in both studies, the blind target person was depicted as female because we've been calling her Mary. So one of the most common questions I got when I started presenting these findings was how these results might generalize to male targets. I've also gotten the question of how my results might generalize to people with other disabilities other than blindness, given that patronizing help is a common experience for people with a wide range of physical disabilities. Is not definitely something that's specific to people who are blind or visually impaired. Both of these are really important questions, but I did not have any answers to either of them because people with disabilities are typically studied as a homogeneous group, and we have very little information about how intersectionality and different types of disabilities might shape the experience of ableism. So in order to provide a more nuanced understanding of the perceptions of confronting patronizing help, I decided to conduct 2 follow-up studies. So in study 3, we addressed the question of whether blind men and women might be perceived differently when they confront patronizing help. Because there is so little existing research on intersectionality and disability, we began the study with 2 possible alternative hypotheses. The first possibility is the double jeopardy hypothesis. And this is the idea that people with multiple stigmatized identities will experience increased discrimination with each additional stigma. If this perspective were to apply in the context of the current study, then blind women will be expected to encounter both disability and gender bias. And because women are often stereotyped as passive and dependent, just like people with disabilities, we might expect that blind women will be penalized more for confronting patronizing help than blind men. Another possibility is the primary stigmatized identity hypothesis. This is the idea that for people with multiple socially devalued identities, one of their identities might emerge as a primary source of stigma. Consistent with this perspective, previous research has shown that both men and women with disabilities tend to be stereotyped as incompetent and dependent. So in the context of the current study, it is possible that the penalty for confronting patronizing help will be similar for both blind men and women. So for this study, we had 137 undergraduate students as participants. We manipulated target gender by randomly assigning participants to read one of 2 possible scenarios. One version of the scenario describes someone named Mary, which is the female condition, and the other version of the scenario described someone named Matt, which was the male condition. Across both experimental conditions and consistent with studies 1 and 2, Mary or Matt was described as a blind working adult who stopped to ask pedestrians for directions. Instead of providing verbal directions as requested, the pedestrian grabbed Mary or Matt's arm without their permission and tried to steer them across the street. Mary or Matt then declined this assistance by engaging in assertive confrontation. Because we've already established in study 2 that confronting patronizing help tends to incur more interpersonal penalties than confronting hostile treatment, we did not include either hostile treatment or a non-confrontation response as control conditions in this study for the sake of parsimony. Participants were asked to rate Mary or Matt with respect to their perceived warmth at 2 time points. First, they provided ratings before the blind target confronting the pedestrian, and then they provided ratings again after the blind target person confronted the pedestrian. Our goal was to see whether there would be a significant decrease in perceived warmth over time. If there is a significant decrease, that would indicate an interpersonal penalty associated with confrontation. In addition, we also wanted to see whether the extent of this penalty would be different for Mary versus Matt. In other words, we wanted to see whether the extent of the penalty will be moderated by target gender. So here is a graph of our results. So the y-axis in this graph represents the difference in perceived warmth between time 1, which is the baseline before the blind target person engaged in confrontation, and time 2, which is after the blind target confronted the pedestrian. There was a significant decrease in perceived warmth from time 1 to time 2. So consistent with studies 1 and 2, participants rated the blind target person as less warm after they confronted the pedestrian. In addition, supporting the primary stigmatized identity hypothesis, this change over time was not moderated by target gender. So in other words, both Mary and Matt were penalized to a similar extent for confronting patronizing help. And this is consistent with the idea that men and women with disabilities tend to be stereotyped in similar ways. Now that we have shown that the consequences of confronting patronizing help are similar for both blind men and women, we turn to the second question that motivated these follow-up experiments, and that is whether the same pattern of results might generalize to targets with another physical disability. So in study 4, we looked at how people who use wheelchairs are perceived when they confront patronizing help in comparison with people who are blind. We chose to focus on people who use wheelchairs in this study because they represent an important segment of the physical disability community. And like those who are blind, they also report common experiences of receiving patronizing help. Because so little research has focused on the heterogeneous experiences of people with different disabilities, this study was largely exploratory, and we did not have any specific hypotheses in mind before implementing the study. So we had 368 entered participants for this study. Participants were randomly assigned to read one of 4 possible scenarios, in which Mary or Matt was described as a working adult who is either blind or using a manual wheelchair. The scenarios we used here were similar to what we used in previous studies, but we did make one important modification. So as you might remember, in the previous studies, Mary or Matt asked for directions from pedestrian because their regular route was blocked by construction. So in a sense, the disabled person did initiate a request for help, even though the response from the pedestrian was clearly excessive and inappropriate. In this study, however, Mary or Matt was approached by a pedestrian, and they were treated in a patronizing manner when they were simply waiting to cross the street. And we made this change because we wanted to see whether the interpersonal penalty associated with confronting patronizing help will be mitigated when the help being offered is completely unsolicited. And therefore, it should be even more clearly inappropriate. So as in study 3, participants rated Mary or Matt with respect to their perceived warmth, both before they confronted, I'm sorry, my office phone just rang. I do apologize for the interruption. So I'm going to keep going with this particular slide. So with respect to the perceived warmth before, after confronting the pedestrian. So we're going to see 2 ratings again, as we did in the previous study. So In this study, we are primarily interested in whether the change in perceived warmth over time will be moderated by target disability type. So again, we have a graph here with change in perceived warmth from time 1 to time 2 on the y-axis. And replicating study 3, we found a significant decrease in perceived warmth over time. So both Mary and Matt, regardless of their disability, were perceived as less warm after versus before they engage in confrontation. We also found a marginally significant interaction between time and target disability type. So although the target who is blind and the target who uses a wheelchair were perceived similarly at time 1, the blind target was perceived as significantly less warm in time 2 relative to the target who uses a wheelchair. This suggests that the blind target was penalized more for confronting patronizing help compared to the target who uses a wheelchair. We are not really sure why this was the case, but one possibility is that members of the public might perceive blind people as more dependent and needing more help compared to people who use wheelchairs. This is consistent with prior survey research, which show that blindness tends to be ranked as one of the most feared disabilities by members of the general public. So to summarize, studies 3 and 4 clearly show that people with disabilities encounter significant backlash when they confront patronizing help. These effects were replicated across both NTERC and student samples, and they remain robust across target gender and disability type. In addition, these studies highlight the importance of attending to intersectionality and diversity within the disability community when studying the experience of ableism. So I have now presented 4 studies that all speak to the interpersonal consequences of confronting patronizing help for people with disabilities. And in light of the findings I have shared with you today, I want to leave you with 3 takeaway points. First of all, ableism remains pervasive in today's society, and it often manifests in subtle yet pernicious ways, such as ambivalent stereotypes and patronizing behaviors. Second, patronizing help can present a dilemma for people with disabilities in terms of how they should respond. So it is really important to approach people with disabilities with respect for their autonomy and to presume competence rather than incompetence. And finally, laws and regulations such as the ADA have certainly gone a long way in terms of changing explicit attitudes and removing structural barriers for people with disabilities. But they are unlikely to modify stereotypes and unconscious biases on the individual level. In other words, there is a difference between being granted certain legal rights and being truly accepted by society. Therefore, it's really important for us to consider individual level intervention strategies such as education and intergroup contact as a complement to programs and policies in order to disrupt disability stereotypes, both on a structural level and also on the individual level. So as I mentioned at the start of this talk, disability intersectionality is something I am very passionate about. So in the last few minutes of this presentation, I want to quickly highlight several future directions in which I plan to incorporate intersectionality into my research on ableism. So first of all, I am interested in addressing the significant physical and behavioral health disparities that are facing Black and Latinx people with disabilities. So compared with non-Hispanic white adults with disabilities in the US, those who are Black or Latinx are more likely to report poor overall physical health. More specifically, data suggest that they report higher rates of chronic medical conditions such as obesity, diabetes, and strokes, And they also experience more difficulties with workforce participation and activities of daily living. One psychosocial stressor underlying these magnified health disparities that has received relatively little empirical attention is intersectional stigma. This refers to the intertwining experiences of racism and ableism. For example, Black and Latinx people with disabilities might experience racial discrimination within the disability community, and yet at the same time, they might also experience discrimination based on their disability within the Black or Latinx communities. These compounding experiences of marginalization can exacerbate feelings of stress and isolation, which can make it harder for Black and Latinx people with disabilities to experience a sense of inclusion and belonging. Because most existing stigma coping interventions tend to focus on single axis of oppression, so they either just focus on ableism or they just focus on racism, I recently submitted a grant proposal for a pilot study. And in this study, I proposed to develop 2 brief web-based interventions that are designed to address intersectional stigma experiences for Black and Latinx people with disabilities. So my goal with this project is to facilitate self-regulation, increase engagement in health promoting behaviors, and also to improve the overall health-related quality of life among Black and Latinx people with disabilities. And I seek to do this by harnessing basic psychological principles such as self-affirmation and self-compassion. In addition to the intersection between disability and race, I'm also very interested in the experiences of people with disabilities who identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. So there are preliminary statistics suggesting that members of the LGBTQ community are more likely to identify as disabled. So approximately 1/3 of LGBTQ adults report having a disability, whereas as I mentioned earlier, the estimate of disability prevalence in the general population is approximately 25%. Unfortunately, very little empirical research has looked at this specific intersection, but I do believe that disability stereotypes and minority stress can exacerbate one another in several different ways based on my understanding of the ableism literature and also from anecdotal evidence from members of the disability and LGBTQ communities. So one example in which these 2 processes might intersect and compound one another is that people with disabilities are commonly stereotyped as asexual. This is why gender can sometimes take a back seat to disability in-person perception, as we saw in study 3. This means that when LGBTQ youth or young adults start questioning or expressing their sexual orientation, they are often dismissed or not taken seriously. LGBTQ individuals with disabilities might also face additional challenges in the coming out process. So a lot of people with disabilities often rely on their family members for day-to-day support or some of the personal care activities. So for these folks, autonomy and privacy can be harder to come by. This can pose unique challenges when the family of people who identify as LGBTQ and also have a disability is not supportive of their sexual orientation or gender identity because individuals with disabilities might not be able to live or build their own life without support from their families. At this point in time, I don't yet have any specific projects planned in this area, but in the next few years, I would like to start by conducting some qualitative research to better understand this intersection and also to hopefully use my qualitative findings to inform the development of tailored stigma coping interventions for LGBTQ people with disabilities. All right. So in closing, I just want to quickly acknowledge my collaborators on the studies I presented today. They are instrumental to help me think about intersectionality and ableism. And I also just want to thank you very much for having me here, for giving me this great opportunity to share my research. And also thanks everyone for coming and for listening to my talk. And I would now be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Wang. I'd love to open it up to questions now. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and we can unmute you. I see some people jumped right off the block. Michaela, would you like to ask the first question or defer to the audience?
Let me ask like a very brief questions, and then I will leave it to the audience. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see like discrimination or exposure to past discrimination affecting like perception of stigma, and whether like this link between past exposure to discrimination and the stigma is it something that you explored in your research, or whether you have any thought about that?
Absolutely. So exposure to discrimination can definitely increase individuals' anticipation of future stigma. There is a lot of evidence showing that discrimination can have a very pervasive impact on the mental health of stigmatized individuals, not just because the experience of discrimination is upsetting, but because even after the discrimination happens, people can continue to worry about experiencing the same discrimination in the future, which can in turn lead to hypervigilance. It can lead to a lot of stress as they approach future interpersonal interactions. And in addition to that, people can also internalize the stigma they faced in the past. So for people who have encountered a lot of negative stereotypes and a lot of discrimination, they might internalize those stereotypes and those beliefs, and they might think that, oh, you know, as a person with a disability, for example, I am not competent, or as a woman, I am not good at math or science. And this kind of internalized beliefs can have a lot of very detrimental impact on the health and educational outcomes of members of the marginalized populations.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Margaret, I see your hands raised. I'll ask to unmute you now.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Such important work, and I learned a lot. My question is actually similar to the previous one, but actually on the flip side, which is in terms of the participants. I wondered if you found or looked for any heterogeneous treatment effects among the survey participants. And in particular, I was wondering if you as a person had experienced discrimination, or if you're part of a group that has more experiences with discriminatory practices, such as belonging to a racial or ethnic minority group, whether or not that actually would end up changing the ways in which you rated how warm or how people responded to the ways in which folks were giving them help. So I wondered if you saw any effects that were differentiated based on racial and ethnic identity groups in particular of your survey participants.
That's a very interesting question. We did not look at that particular intersection between race and treatment effects. I would imagine that, you know, people who have encountered a lot of discrimination in the past, whether it's for race, whether it's for sexual orientation, might be more empathetic towards people with disabilities, and that might in turn shape their ratings of the target person. But at the same time, it's also true that different stigmatized identities can entail heterogeneous forms of discrimination, and experiences of racial discrimination might not necessarily lead people to become more sensitized to the experiences of ableism. So it can really go both ways. In our studies, unfortunately, the majority of our participants are white. I think around 75% of participants were white across all studies. So it might be a little bit more difficult to look at the intersection between race and treatment effects in particular, but that's definitely a very interesting direction I would like to pursue in future research.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right, and then I see Colin, I see your hand raised. I'll ask to unmute you now. If it's possible to turn on your video, if that's something you feel comfortable with, that would be great. No problems if not.
Yep. Yes, there were. Hi, Dr. Wang. Thank you so much for your talk, for your research. My name is Colin Killick. I'm executive director of a disability rights organization called Disability Policy Consortium. I'm an early 30s white man with a beard and a green plaid shirt. Yeah, I'm curious how you think that these effects in terms of stigma or reaction to patronizing help might impact the ways that policymakers approach issues of disability.
Could you repeat that question one more time? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
Of course. I wonder how you think that these effects around unwanted help and stigmatizing the responses of people with disabilities to unwanted help might impact the ways that policymakers approach issues related to disability.
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest takeaway lessons I learned from these studies is that it's really important to have the voices of people with disabilities represented in the policymaking process, right? So as we saw in the first study I presented, there is a huge difference in terms of how non-disabled people perceive patronizing help versus how disabled people perceive patronizing help. And if we did not look at the perspective of disabled people in that particular context, we might have concluded that patronizing help is completely acceptable. So I think that really speaks to the importance of including the voices of people with disabilities in any kind of discussion when it comes to policies that are about people with disabilities. So one really popular slogan in the disability rights movement recently is nothing about us without us. And I think these studies definitely support that statement.
Great, thank you so much. And I see Tanushree hand is raised. Tanushree, if you would feel comfortable turning on your video, we can spotlight you. If not, no worries.
Can you hear me? Is
Yes.
Audible? Okay. Thank you, Katie. This was such an impressive, research. So congratulations for presenting this today. And
thank you.
Terrific. My questions were really around the motivations for why people react in these discriminatory ways. And I wonder, is it that people think that people with disabilities should just accept their help for some psychological reasons? Or do they think that their behavior is not patronizing? So is this like an information issue, or is this really that even if they knew that this was patronizing, they should just think that people should accept their help in whatever form it is available?
Yes, I think it's probably largely driven by the fact that non-disabled people do not see this behavior as patronizing. Now, the interesting question is, why that is the case, right? Like, obviously, people would not behave this way when they are interacting with a non-disabled person. So why do they feel justified when they are interacting with a disabled person? Why do they not see their behavior as not patronizing? And I think one explanation might be the presumption of incompetence when people see a disabled person. They might assume that the person is in danger. They might assume that the blind person does not know how to cross the street. They might implicitly infantilize the disabled person and thinking about that person as if they were a small child, and they were just trying to keep the kid from running into traffic, for example. So I think it all goes back to disability stereotyping and the fact that when people see a disabled person, they make assumptions about the person's abilities, which are not founded in reality.
Thank you so much. All right, I don't see any other hands raised. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to click the raise hand button under the reactions or the participants tabs, and we'll know you have a question and we can unmute you for that.
I have another question, so let me I have another question. So you suggested that there could be like education practices that may help, like reducing, like education intervention that may help reducing like this patronizing behavior, or like any form of like stigma that we have toward like disabled groups. And I was wondering whether like you have like some concrete example, or whether you know some intervention that worked on this domain.
Yes, so based on the existing literature, intergroup contact is one of the most effective ways of reducing stigma. So by intergroup contact, I'm referring to, bringing people who are, in this case, if you're talking about disability, we are bringing people who, without disabilities into contact with people with disabilities. So for example, we might have them do a joint group activity. We might have them work on a project together. And that kind of intergroup contact can potentially improve people's perceptions of disabled individuals, and it can lead them to see disabled individuals as more competent and more independent. Now, I think it's important to point out that intergroup contact does not work well in all contexts. So the contact needs to be equal status, and it needs to be structured in order for it to work. So if a person without a disability is just running into a person with a disability, like randomly, they are not given any instructions, they're not, given any kind of guidance in terms of how to interact with one another, that might not necessarily work in terms of reducing stigma. And similarly, if a non-disabled person is just assigned as a helper to assist with the disabled person, that's not going to work very well either. So it has to be equal status contact, and ideally it should be collaborative. I think that's when intergroup contact tends to work the best.
Thank you so much for this. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Right, so while we see if there's any other questions that'll come in, Professor Wang, I'll ask if there's anything that you haven't shared with us today that you would like us to know.
So I think, one question I get a lot when I present this set of findings is, what do you do when you see a disabled person? Is it not okay to offer the person help? So I just want to, quickly address that. I don't want to leave everyone with the impression that we should never help a disabled person, because that's not obviously my intention. What I would say to that is that it's, of course, okay to offer help, but it's important to offer instead of assume. So if you see a blind person waiting to cross the street, and if you're not sure whether the person can cross safely, it's perfectly fine to ask, hey, do you need help crossing the street? But the important part is you need to listen to what that blind person says, right? If that person says, sure, I would love your help, then you should definitely help. If that person said, no, I've got it, thank you very much, then move on with your day. Don't insist, don't say, are you sure? Don't say, oh, let me help you anyway. So the issue here is really about respect. The patronizing behavior in the studies I presented today is so problematic because the person grabbed onto Mary's arm without her permission, right? So as long as you're asking for permission, as long as you are treating the disabled person with respect, please do feel free to offer help, and there's no reason to feel awkward about interacting with disabled people.
Great, thank you. I see Pamela has raised her hand. I'll ask you to unmute. Great, there we go.
Okay, oh yeah, I'm unmuted. Hello, Dr. Wang. Thank you so very much for your presentation. I have a question in regards to whether you have ideas for future studies that involve not as visible disabilities. I remember at the beginning when you were giving a definition, you had mentioned like physical disabilities, but you had also mentioned like mental ones as well. And so I was curious about if there's any ideas around like testing for people's perceptions of like people either denying or even succumbing to like patronizing behaviors when it comes to interpersonal relationships when a disability is revealed, particularly those that are not particularly visible. So I was just curious if you had like ideas about that for future work.
Right, that's a very interesting question. So people with visible versus invisible disabilities tend to face very different challenges when in their interpersonal interactions. So one piece of insight I've heard from members of the disability community is that when you have a visible disability, you're constantly trying to overcome people's assumption that you can't do certain things. But when you have an invisible disability, you're constantly trying to justify the fact that you indeed cannot do certain things because people tend to assume that you can do more than you actually can, right? So I think it will be kind of interesting to look at how patronizing behaviors might apply to people with invisible disabilities, whether that's still going to be an issue for that population, or whether in the case of people with invisible disabilities, being accused of faking their disabilities or being accused of getting special treatment might be a more salient challenge for their population, just because their disability is not visible. So people might assume that it's not real.
Got it. Thank you so very much.
Sure.
Great. And I see Meredith has their hand raised. I will ask to unmute you now.
First, thank you very much for the talk. It was really some excellent work. And I especially appreciate now your comments about invisible versus visible disabilities. I did want to add to your answer to your comment on the issue of offering help, which is whatever you do, do not touch the person or their equipment without asking, because this is often a real problem. For instance, if you grab a person's wheelchair before asking, can I help you? You may accidentally cause a problem to the wheelchair, change some setting, whatever. Similarly, people don't like being grabbed. And so if you grab a blind person's arm before asking, can I help you? It feels like an assault, just the way it would feel like an assault to you if you were standing at a traffic light and someone grabbed your arm. And this is something that's often missed.
Thank you so much for raising that point. That's an excellent point. I think oftentimes when we are talking about the experiences of people with disabilities, one thing that comes up over and over again is the lack of consent. People feel like they can violate our physical boundaries. As long as they're trying to help, they can, do anything they would like. They can touch us whenever they want. And that's just not expression of respect. You will not randomly touch a non-disabled person without their permission, and just and by that token, you should not touch a disabled person without their permission either, and that includes their body and also their mobility equipment.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to pass it back to Michaela to close us out.
Thank you so much, Professor Katie Wang, and to all of you for attending.